The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and gold. The small town of Mayfield, a speck on the map along Interstate 40, was alive with the hum of evening activity. Locals bustled around Ruby's Diner, a staple of the community for over 2 decades. Known for its homemade apple pie and hearty meals, the diner was more than a place to eat. It was a gathering spot, a slice of Americana in a changing world. Jack Harlow parked his truck in his usual spot in the dirt lot outside the diner. His 18-wheeler, a blue Kenworth W900 with polished chrome accents, gleamed under the setting sun. Jack, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, stepped out of the cab with the ease of someone accustomed to long hours on the road. Dressed in a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans, he carried an air of quiet confidence. As he walked toward the diner, Ruby Morales spotted him through the window. Ruby was in her early 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor that belied her warm heart. She had run the diner since her parents passed, and to the people of Mayfield, she was more than just the owner. She was a pillar of the community. "Evening, Jack," Ruby greeted as he stepped through the door. "Evening, Ruby," Jack replied, taking his usual seat at the counter. "Meatloaf special, if it's ready." "You're in luck," Ruby said with a smile. Fresh out of the oven. The diner was lively but peaceful. Families gathered in booths, an older couple shared coffee at the corner table, and a few truckers chatted about their routes. Jack settled in, savoring the familiarity of the scene. The tranquility shattered when the roar of motorcycles pierced the air. Heads turned toward the windows as 3 bikes pulled into the lot, their engines growling like restless beasts. The riders dismounted, their leather jackets adorned with the logo of a snarling black wolf. "Black wolves," someone muttered under their breath. The leader of the group, Cole Viper Banning, swaggered into the diner first. He was tall and wiry, with piercing eyes that scanned the room like a predator sizing up its prey. Behind him were 2 others, Mason Crash Ward, a stocky man with a menacing grin, and Dean Ghost Carter, whose lanky frame belied his quick temper. The room fell silent as the trio made their way to the counter. Ruby straightened, her face calm but her eyes watchful. "Cozy place you got here," Viper said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Real homey." Ruby kept her tone neutral. "What can I get you?" "How about a little chat first?" Viper leaned on the counter, flashing a cold smile. "We're new in town, and we're looking to make friends. Friends help each other out, don't they?" Ruby raised an eyebrow. "What kind of help are you looking for?" "Protection," Viper said, his voice soft but menacing. "Things happen, Ruby. Equipment breaks, deliveries get delayed, customers stop showing up. We make sure none of that happens, for a small fee." The room tensed. Jack, who had been quietly eating, glanced up, his eyes narrowing. "I don't think we need your kind of help," Ruby said firmly. Crash chuckled, leaning against a booth where a young couple Saturday. "She's got guts. I'll give her that." Jack set down his fork and turned to Viper. "The lady said she's not interested." Viper turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Jack's. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Just a guy having dinner," Jack said, his voice calm but steady. "Now, why don't you finish your business and move on?" The room held its breath as the tension crackled like a live wire. For a moment, it seemed like Viper might lash out, but then he smirked and stepped back. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man," Viper said. "We'll see how far that gets you." He turned to Ruby, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "We'll be back to discuss this further. Think it over." The trio left the diner, their laughter echoing ominously as they mounted their bikes and roared off into the night. The room exhaled collectively. Ruby shook her head. "Well, that's just what we needed." "You okay?" Jack asked. "I'll be fine," Ruby said, though her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for another customer. "Thanks for stepping in." Jack nodded, but said nothing more. Inside, his mind was already working. He had seen men like Viper before, bullies who thrived on fear and intimidation. He knew they wouldn't stop with a warning. Later that night, as Jack climbed into his truck, he made a decision. Mayfield wasn't just another stop on his route. It was a place worth protecting. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Sam," Jack said when the voice on the other end answered. I need your help. Trouble's brewing, and I can't handle it alone. The quiet streets of Mayfield didn't feel the same the morning after the Black Wolves' arrival. The usual hum of small-town life was muted, replaced by uneasy whispers among the townspeople. Ruby's diner opened as usual, but the lively chatter that usually accompanied breakfast was subdued. Ruby tried to act like everything was normal, but the lingering tension was hard to ignore. Jack Harlow sat in his usual spot, sipping coffee and scanning the room. The Black Wolves had left more than a threat. They had planted fear. The way the locals avoided eye contact and kept their voices low spoke volumes. Jack had seen it before, in towns far from home where lawlessness thrived. Ruby set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him. Rough start to the day? She asked. Could say that, Jack replied, his voice low. How about you? Sleep okay? Ruby shook her head. Not really. I kept hearing those bikes, even when they weren't there. She hesitated before adding, they'll be back, won't they? Jack nodded. Yeah, they will. Guys like that don't bluff. Ruby's eyes searched his face. What are we supposed to do? Sheriff Donovan's just one man, and we're not exactly a town of fighters. Jack leaned forward slightly. You're more resilient than you think. We'll figure it out. Before Ruby could respond, the sound of engines rumbled in the distance. Her hands froze mid-wipe as the Black Wolves rode down Main Street, their presence a brazen reminder that they weren't going anywhere. They didn't stop this time, but their slow cruise past the diner felt like a warning. By mid-afternoon, the gang's intimidation tactics were in full swing. A delivery truck headed to Mayfield's grocery store was blocked on the highway, its driver harassed until he agreed to turn around. Later, the power at the mechanic shop mysteriously went out, forcing a halt in business. At the diner, Ruby received a phone call. When she answered, all she heard was breathing before the line went dead. The same happened to the hardware store owner and the florist down the street. Jack witnessed these acts with a grim sense of familiarity. The Black Wolves were testing the waters, chipping away at the community's resolve. Sheriff Donovan stopped by the diner later that day. The sheriff, a tall man in his early 50s with a graying mustache and weary eyes, was a decent man doing the best he could with limited resources. I've been getting calls all day, Donovan said, sitting at the counter. People are scared, and I don't blame them. These guys aren't just passing through, they're setting up shop. What are you planning to do about it? Jack asked, his tone neutral. Donovan sighed. Not much I can do. It's just me and 2 deputies, Jack. I've already filed a report with the state police, but who knows how long it'll take them to act. We don't exactly top their priority list. Jack considered his words carefully. Then we handle it ourselves. The people in this town deserve better than to live in fear. The sheriff looked at Jack, recognizing the determination in his expression. You've got a plan? Not yet, Jack admitted, but I've got some calls to make. That evening, Jack sat in his truck, scrolling through a list of names in his phone. Each name brought back memories of his time in the military. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of a tight-knit team that had faced the worst the world had to offer. He knew he could count on them. The first call went to Sam Grayson, a tech expert who had once hacked an enemy communication network in the middle of a firefight. Jack, Sam said, his voice warm with recognition. Been a while. What's going on? Jack explained the situation. Sam listened in silence before replying, You know I'm in. I'll bring some gear, too. Next, Jack called Mia Steele-Carter, a former martial arts instructor who had taught self-defense to soldiers and civilians alike. Let me guess, Mia said when Jack finished explaining. You want me to whip a bunch of civilians into shape? Something like that, Jack said. Sounds fun. I'm on my way. One by one, Jack reached out to others, building a network of trusted allies. The next day, Ruby noticed a change in Jack's demeanor. He seemed sharper, more focused, as if a switch had flipped. What are you up to? She asked, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. Getting ready, Jack replied. We can't wait for someone else to solve this problem. It's on us. Ruby frowned. You really think we can fight back? Jack looked at her, his expression resolute. Ruby, you've been fighting every day just by keeping this diner open. The people in this town are stronger than they realize. They just need a little push. That afternoon, Sam arrived in town, pulling a trailer loaded with equipment. The tech was set up security cameras around the diner and other key locations, ensuring they'd have eyes on the gang's movements. Mia showed up shortly after, immediately diving into training sessions with the townspeople. At first, the idea of self-defense classes was met with skepticism, but as the days went on, more people joined in. Even Sheriff Donovan started practicing with them. The Black Wolves didn't like what they saw. The town was no longer cowering in fear. People walked with their heads held high, and businesses stayed open despite the gang's efforts. One evening, Viper and his crew returned to the diner. This time, they brought more members, making a show of force. They crowded into the parking lot, their presence impossible to ignore. Inside, Jack stood by the counter, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. The townspeople looked to him for guidance. Viper sauntered in, a cruel grin on his face. "Seems like you've been busy, old man." "Just making sure everyone's safe," Jack replied evenly. Viper's grin faltered. He could sense something different, something stronger, in the town. "You're making a mistake," Viper said, his tone low and threatening. "No," Jack said firmly. "You are." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without another word, Viper turned and walked out. As the gang roared away, Jack addressed the townspeople. "This isn't over, but we've got something they don't, each other. Stay strong, and we'll get through this." The following morning, Mayfield awoke with an air of anticipation. News of the Black Wolves' intimidation had spread across town, and while some residents stayed behind locked doors, others began to gather at Ruby's diner. It was becoming clear that the town couldn't ignore the threat any longer. The diner, once a place for casual conversation over coffee and pie, was now a hub of whispered discussions about what to do next. Jack Harlow sat at the counter, watching the townsfolk shuffle in, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. Ruby moved between tables, refilling coffee mugs and offering comforting smiles, though Jack could see the strain in her eyes. He knew this was the moment to act, to give the people of Mayfield the confidence they needed to stand together. Jack stood, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. "Folks, we need to talk." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. Jack's calm demeanor carried weight, and the townspeople instinctively trusted him, even if they didn't know the full extent of his past. "We all know why we're here," Jack began, his voice steady. "The Black Wolves think they can take over our town. They want us to live in fear, to give in without a fight. But I've seen bullies like them before, and I'll tell you this, they're not unstoppable." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Jack raised a hand to quiet them. "Standing up to them won't be easy. It'll take more than just hope. We need a plan, and we need to work together. If we do, we can show them that Mayfield isn't a place to be pushed around." From the back of the diner, Pastor Allen, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, stood. "Jack, we're not soldiers. Most of us wouldn't even know where to start." "You don't need to be soldiers," Jack replied. "You just need to be willing to stand up for your neighbors, for your families. I've called in a few friends to help us get organized. They'll be here soon, and together, we'll make sure this town is ready." Ruby stepped forward, her voice firm. "Jack's right. This is our home. If we don't defend it, no one else will. I say we trust him and do what needs to be done." One by one, heads nodded around the room. The mood shifted from uncertainty to resolve, and Jack felt a flicker of hope. By midday, the first of Jack's reinforcements arrived. Sam Grayson pulled into the diner's parking lot in a beat-up van, stepping out with a broad grin. Despite his slightly disheveled appearance, Sam's sharp eyes revealed the brilliant mind behind them. "Jack," Sam greeted, clapping his old friend on the shoulder. "I see you've been keeping busy." "Busy enough," Jack replied with a rare smile. "You bring the gear?" Sam gestured to the van. "Everything you asked for. Cameras, radios, even a drone. Let's get to work." As Sam set up surveillance equipment around the diner and other key locations, more of Jack's allies arrived. Mia Steele Carter rolled into town on her motorcycle, her athletic frame and no-nonsense attitude immediately commanding attention. She wasted no time, gathering volunteers to start training in basic self-defense. At first, The townspeople were hesitant. Many had never thrown a punch, let alone thought about defending themselves. But Mia's patience and encouragement soon won them over. She emphasized simple, practical techniques, how to break a hold, how to block an attack, and, most importantly, how to stay calm under pressure. Meanwhile, Jack and Sam worked with Sheriff Donovan to map out a defense plan. They identified choke points around town, places where the Black Wolves might try to force their way in. They also set up a schedule for patrols, ensuring that every corner of Mayfield was watched. The mayor, a cautious man named Ellis Reed, initially resisted Jack's efforts. "We're not a militia, Jack," he argued during a town meeting. "What you're proposing could escalate things." Jack met his gaze evenly. "Doing nothing will escalate things faster. The Black Wolves don't care about negotiation or compromise. If we don't show them we're serious, they'll take everything. Is that what you want?" Ellis hesitated before finally nodding. "All right, I'm with you." As the days passed, the spirit of Mayfield began to change. Where there had been fear and resignation, there was now determination. Neighbors who rarely spoke began working together, sharing tools, supplies, and information. The diner became the town's command center, with Ruby organizing meals for the volunteers and Sam monitoring the security feeds from a makeshift station in the back. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack stood outside the diner, watching the townspeople train under Mia's guidance. Ruby joined him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You've got them believing in themselves," she said, handing him a cup. "They had it in them all along," Jack replied. "They just needed a reason to show it." Ruby studied him for a moment. "You're not just doing this for the town, are you? This is personal." Jack took a sip of coffee, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when people like the Black Wolves get their way. Not here, Ruby. Not this time." The night air was cool and quiet, but both Jack and Ruby knew the calm wouldn't last. The Black Wolves were watching, and it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. For now, though, Mayfield was ready. The first crack of trouble came before dawn. It started with the unsettling sound of roaring engines in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Jack Harlow was already awake, standing outside Ruby's diner with a cup of coffee in hand. The town was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Sam Grayson, crouched over a laptop inside the diner, called out through the open door. "Jack, cameras picked up movement. South end of town. Looks like they're testing the waters." Jack nodded, setting his coffee down. He'd anticipated this. The Black Wolves were predators, and predators rarely attacked head-on without first gauging the strength of their prey. Sheriff Donovan pulled into the lot moments later, stepping out of his cruiser with a grim expression. "They've been riding in circles near the old gas station. Not doing anything illegal, yet. Just making sure we know they're there." Jack's voice was steady. "That's the first step. They're probing us, seeing if we're ready to fight or fold." Donovan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're ready, right?" Jack didn't hesitate. "We're ready." By mid-morning, the Black Wolves escalated. A group of riders roared into the parking lot of a local grocery store, revving their engines and shouting taunts. Inside, customers cowered as the gang sauntered through the aisles, knocking over displays and making a mess. Ruby's phone rang moments later, the trembling voice of the store owner on the other end. "They're here, Ruby. I don't know what to do." Jack overheard and grabbed his jacket. "We do what we've been preparing for. Stay calm and stick to the plan." Jack, Mia, and Donovan arrived at the store within minutes. As they pulled into the lot, the gang was already outside, lounging on their bikes with smug grins. Their leader, Cole Viper Banning, stood at the forefront, his arms crossed as he watched Jack step out of the truck. "Well, if it isn't the town hero," Viper drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Come to save the day?" Jack approached slowly, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "You've made your point. Now it's time to leave." Viper laughed, glancing back at his crew. "Or what? You gonna stop us, old man?" Jack's eyes didn't waver. "If I have to." For a moment, the parking lot was silent, the tension so thick it seemed to hang in the air. Then one of the gang members, Mason Crash Ward, stepped forward, his hand drifting toward the chain hanging from his belt. "Careful," Jack warned, his voice low but firm. You make a move, and this ends badly for you. Crash hesitated, glancing at Viper for guidance. Viper's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He could feel the eyes of the town on him. The people watching from windows, the sheriff standing ready, and Jack, who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had been through worse than this. Viper held up a hand, signaling for his men to back down. This ain't over, he said, climbing onto his bike. Not by a long shot. The gang roared away, leaving a trail of dust and tension in their wake. That night, Jack called an emergency meeting at the diner. The room was packed, every seat taken and every face tense with worry. Ruby stood by Jack's side, her presence a steadying force. We held them off today, Jack began, addressing the crowd. But they're not done. They'll come back, and next time, it'll be worse. We need to stay strong, stay united, and stick to the plan. Pastor Allen stood. They're testing our resolve. We can't let them see us falter. Mia nodded from the corner. We've made progress. People are learning to defend themselves, to work together. That's what scares them. They're used to picking on the weak, and we're showing them we're not weak. The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Jack took a step forward. Tomorrow, we double down. Patrols will run around the clock. Sam's cameras are giving us eyes everywhere, and we'll make sure no one is left alone. If you see something suspicious, report it. We're not fighting them alone. We're fighting as a community. The crowd dispersed with a renewed sense of purpose. The Black Wolves didn't waste time. By the next afternoon, they returned in greater numbers. 10 riders roared into Mayfield, their presence an overt show of force. This time, they parked outside Ruby's diner, the unofficial heart of the town's resistance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but prepared. Jack stood near the counter, watching through the window as the gang dismounted their bikes. Sheriff Donovan was at the opposite end of the room, his hand resting casually near his holstered sidearm. Mia and several townspeople, now confident in their training, positioned themselves strategically around the diner. Viper led the way inside, his boots heavy on the floor as he surveyed the room. His gaze landed on Jack, his lip curling into a sneer. "Looks like you've got yourself a little army," Viper said, his voice laced with disdain. "But numbers don't mean much when they're untrained." Jack stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "They're trained enough, and they're not scared of you." Viper's eyes scanned the room, noticing for the first time the calm resolve in the faces around him. These weren't terrified civilians anymore. They were people who had found their strength. "You're making a mistake," Viper warned, his bravado faltering. "No," Jack replied, his tone steady. "You are." The standoff was brief but intense. After a long, charged silence, Viper turned and gestured to his men. "Let's go. We'll deal with this another way." The gang filed out, their departure less triumphant than their arrival. In the days that followed, the Black Wolves shifted tactics. They began targeting individuals, vandalizing homes, and issuing anonymous threats. But Jack's preparations paid off. The surveillance cameras captured clear images of the culprits, and Sheriff Donovan, with support from state police, began building a case against the gang. The tide was turning. One evening, as Jack and Ruby sat outside the diner, watching the sunset, Ruby spoke softly. "Do you think we're winning?" Jack took a long breath. "We're holding our ground. That's the first step. They're realizing this town isn't easy prey." Ruby smiled faintly. "You've given us something we didn't have before, hope." Jack didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his past lifting, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't known he needed. But he also knew the fight was far from over. The morning sky over Mayfield was a flat gray, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The town had settled into an uneasy rhythm, watchful, prepared, but knowing that trouble was just over the horizon. The Black Wolves had been quiet for 2 days, and the silence was unnerving. Jack Harlow stood outside Ruby's diner, his sharp eyes scanning the empty street. Beside him, Sam Grayson fiddled with his drone controller, the small device buzzing as it hovered above the rooftops. "They're regrouping," Jack said, his voice low. Sam nodded, his gaze fixed on the live feed from the drone. probably calling in reinforcements. They won't like how things went last time. Ruby stepped out of the diner, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. You're sure they're coming back? Jack took the mug with a nod of thanks. It's not a question of if, it's when. The calm before the storm didn't last. By midday, reports started trickling in. A delivery truck headed for the local grocery store was found abandoned on the highway, its driver shaken but unharmed. A farmer's barn on the outskirts of town was set ablaze, the black smoke visible for miles. Jack gathered his core team at the diner. Ruby, Sheriff Donovan, Sam, and Mia, Steel Carter. The tension in the room was palpable. They're ramping up, Donovan said, his tone grim, trying to scare us into submission. They're testing our limits, Jack added. But we don't scare easy. Mia leaned forward, her eyes flashing with determination. What's the plan? We can't just sit around waiting for them to make the next move. Jack placed a map of the town on the table. We double our patrols and fortify key locations. Sam's cameras give us an advantage, but we need boots on the ground. Sheriff, can you coordinate with the volunteers? Donovan nodded. I'll make it happen. Mia, Jack continued, keep the training sessions going. People need to feel confident they can protect themselves. And you? Ruby asked. Jack's gaze was steady. I'll be watching the highways. If they're bringing in more riders, we'll see them coming. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. The townspeople worked tirelessly, strengthening barricades and reinforcing doors and windows. Sam's network of cameras and drones kept constant watch, while Mia's training sessions grew more rigorous. Despite the seriousness of the situation, a sense of solidarity blossomed in Mayfield. Neighbors who had once been strangers now worked side by side, their shared purpose binding them together. The diner became a hub of activity, with Ruby providing hot meals and a steady supply of encouragement. Jack, however, couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Late one evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, the Black Wolves made their move. A convoy of motorcycles thundered into town, their headlights piercing the darkness like predatory eyes. This time, there were more of them, 15 riders, each armed and ready for a fight. The gang divided into 2 groups. One headed toward the diner, while the other made for the town's gas station. Jack, who had been patrolling near the outskirts, spotted them first. Sam, he barked into his radio. They're here. 15 riders, splitting up. Get everyone in position. Back at the diner, Sheriff Donovan rallied the volunteers. Mia took charge of securing the families who had sought refuge there, guiding them to the basement. Ruby stood behind the counter, her expression firm despite the fear in her eyes. Jack arrived moments before the gang reached the diner. He stepped out of his truck, his presence commanding as he faced the approaching riders. Cole Viper, Banning dismounted first, his expression a mixture of anger and arrogance. Still playing hero, old man? Jack didn't flinch. Still trying to bully your way into places you don't belong? Viper's grin turned to a snarl. You've made this a lot harder than it needed to be, but it ends tonight. The confrontation began with words, but it didn't take long for tempers to ignite. One of the gang members, Dean Ghost Carter, charged toward the diner, only to be intercepted by a group of townspeople led by Mia. Her training paid off as the volunteers held their ground, forcing the gang to retreat momentarily. At the gas station, the second group of bikers met a different kind of resistance. Sheriff Donovan and a few volunteers had fortified the area, turning it into a bottleneck. When the gang tried to push through, they were met with a wall of determined defenders. The fight spread across town, a chaotic dance of strategy and sheer will. Jack directed the efforts from the front lines, his military experience shining as he coordinated movements and adjusted plans on the fly. Ruby stayed in the diner, offering support over the radio and tending to those who were injured. Her calm presence was a lifeline for many, a reminder of what they were fighting for. As dawn broke, the rain subsided, leaving the streets of Mayfield slick and glistening. The Black Wolves, battered and defeated, retreated into the desert, their once fearsome reputation in tatters. Jack stood in the middle of Main Street, his shirt torn and dirt streaking his face. Around him, the townspeople emerged from their makeshift defenses, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Ruby approached, her steps hesitant but her voice steady. "We did it." Jack nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "We won this round, but they'll be back, and we need to be ready." The town had weathered the storm, but Jack knew the battle was far from over. The Black Wolves wouldn't accept defeat easily, and Mayfield's newfound unity would be tested again. For now, though, the town stood together, stronger than it had ever been. The calm after the storm didn't last long. The Black Wolves, humiliated and desperate to reassert their dominance, began preparing for an all-out attack. Back at their desert hideout, Cole Viper, Banning gathered his remaining crew and called in favors from allied gangs across the region. By the time they were ready, the Black Wolves' numbers had swelled to over 30 riders, armed and determined to crush Mayfield once and for all. In town, the atmosphere was tense but resolute. The people of Mayfield, buoyed by their victory during the last confrontation, knew they had little time to rest. Jack Harlow and his team worked tirelessly to strengthen their defenses. "We've got eyes on every major road leading into town," Sam Grayson reported, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he monitored the drone feeds. "If they come, we'll see them." "They'll come," Jack said, his tone grim. "The question is when." Ruby Morales leaned against the counter, a frown etched across her face. "We've done everything we can, haven't we?" "We've done enough," Jack replied. "Now we just need to hold the line." It was late afternoon when the first signs of the Wolves' return appeared. Sam's drone picked up a convoy of motorcycles heading straight for Mayfield. The video feed showed dozens of riders, their black leather vests like shadows against the dusty highway. "They're coming in force," Sam said, his voice tight. Jack grabbed his radio. "This is it, folks. Everyone to your positions. Stick to the plan, and we'll get through this." The townspeople sprang into action. Mia Carter led a group of volunteers to the eastern barricade, where they reinforced their defenses with sandbags and makeshift barriers. Sheriff Donovan positioned his deputies at key vantage points, their radios crackling with updates. Ruby stayed at the diner, coordinating efforts and ensuring the families taking refuge in the basement were safe. The Wolves arrived at sunset. The sound of their engines reverberated through the town, a low, menacing growl that sent shivers down every spine. They stopped just outside the barricade on Main Street, their numbers stretching across the road. Viper dismounted first, his face twisted with anger. He stepped forward, flanked by his lieutenants, and shouted toward the barricade. "Enough of this." Viper's voice boomed. "You think you can stand against us? You're nothing but a bunch of farmers and truck drivers. Give up now, and we'll let you walk away." Jack stepped out from behind the barricade, his presence commanding. "This is our town," he said, his voice steady and strong. "And we're not going anywhere." Viper sneered. "Brave words, old man. Let's see how long you last." With a wave of his hand, the Wolves surged forward. The battle was chaotic and fierce. The Wolves hit the barricades hard, but the townspeople were ready. They used every advantage they had: tight choke points, elevated positions, and the element of surprise. Mia and her team fought valiantly at the eastern barricade, holding the line with determination. Sheriff Donovan and his deputies provided cover from nearby rooftops, their precision shots keeping the Wolves at bay. At the diner, Ruby coordinated over the radio, her calm voice a beacon of reassurance. Injured volunteers were brought to her, and she worked tirelessly alongside Doc Harper, the town's retired physician, to treat their wounds. Jack moved like a ghost through the battlefield, directing groups where they were needed most. His military experience was evident in every decision he made, turning the townspeople's inexperience into a coordinated effort. The Wolves, despite their numbers, began to falter. The townspeople's unity and preparation had caught them off guard, and their attacks became increasingly disorganized. As the battle raged, Viper realized his plan was unraveling. Standing in the middle of the street, he watched in disbelief as his riders were pushed back. His anger boiled over, and he grabbed a shotgun from his bike, determined to take Jack down himself. He spotted Jack near the diner, giving orders to a group of volunteers. Raising the shotgun, Viper took aim and fired. The shot grazed Jack's shoulder, knocking him off balance. Ruby, who had been nearby, rushed to his side. "Jack!" she cried, helping him to his feet. "I'm fine," Jack said through gritted teeth, his gaze locking onto Viper. Viper stepped forward, his shotgun raised again. "This ends now." Before he could fire, Sheriff Donovan appeared from the side, his own weapon drawn. "Drop it, Viper," Donovan ordered, his voice cold. Viper hesitated, his eyes darting between Donovan and Jack. Then, with a roar of frustration, he threw the shotgun to the ground and raised his hands. The wolves, seeing their leader captured, began to retreat. One by one, their motorcycles roared back onto the highway, leaving Mayfield behind. As the dust settled, the townspeople emerged from their positions, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Cheers erupted as the reality of their victory sank in. Jack, his shoulder bandaged by Ruby, stood in the middle of Main Street, watching as the remaining wolves disappeared into the horizon. "We did it," Ruby said softly, standing beside him. Jack nodded. "Yeah, we did." The aftermath was a flurry of activity. Sheriff Donovan called in reinforcements from the state police, who arrived within hours to process the captured wolves and document the evidence. The gang's defeat sent shockwaves through the region, and investigations into their criminal network began in earnest. The town of Mayfield, battered but unbroken, became a symbol of resilience and unity. That night, as the town celebrated their hard-won victory, Jack sat outside the diner, watching the stars. Ruby joined him, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. "You're a hero, you know," she said. Jack shook his head. "I just did what needed to be done." Ruby smiled. "Well, I think Mayfield's lucky to have you." Jack didn't respond, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and Mayfield was safe, for now. The morning after the battle, Mayfield was eerily quiet. The acrid smell of smoke lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of damp earth from the previous night's rain. The streets bore the marks of the conflict: shattered glass, scorched pavement, and scattered debris. But despite the physical scars, there was an undeniable sense of triumph among the townspeople. Jack Harlow stood at the edge of Main Street, surveying the aftermath. His shoulder was tightly bandaged beneath his jacket, a dull ache reminding him of the previous night's close call. He watched his neighbors work together to clear the rubble, their voices carrying a mix of exhaustion and determination. Ruby Morales approached, holding a thermos of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing it to him. Jack accepted it with a nod. "Thanks. How's everyone holding up?" "Better than I expected," Ruby replied. "A few injuries, but nothing life-threatening. People are already talking about rebuilding." "That's good," Jack said, his gaze drifting toward the diner. The familiar building bore new scars, broken windows, scorched siding, but it still stood, much like the town itself. Inside the diner, Sheriff Donovan was meeting with a group of state police officers. The Black Wolves' captured leader, Cole "Viper" Banning, had been transferred to their custody earlier that morning, along with several of his crew. The sheriff wore an expression of tired satisfaction as he updated Jack and Ruby. "They've got enough evidence to keep Viper and his gang locked up for a long time," Donovan said. "Turns out, the state police have been after them for months. Our fight here gave them what they needed to move in on their larger operations." Jack nodded. "That's good news. What about the rest of the gang?" "Most of them scattered," Donovan replied. "But the word's out. Mayfield isn't a soft target anymore. They won't be coming back." Ruby let out a sigh of relief. Finally, some peace. Jack wasn't as quick to relax. "Peace isn't permanent. We need to stay prepared, just in case." Over the next few days, the town came together like never before. Volunteers worked around the clock to repair homes and businesses, with Ruby's Diner serving as the central hub for meals and supplies. Donations poured in from nearby communities, and construction crews arrived to help rebuild. Mia Steele Carter continued to hold self-defense classes, now attended by nearly half the town. Though the immediate threat was gone, many residents saw the value in staying prepared. Sam Grayson, ever the tech whiz, began upgrading the town's surveillance system. "Just because the wolves are gone doesn't mean we let our guard down," he said as he installed new cameras at key locations. Jack, true to his nature, spent most of his time working alongside the townspeople. Whether it was helping to patch up a roof or clearing debris from the streets, he was always there, his quiet determination inspiring those around him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the townspeople gathered at the diner for an impromptu celebration. The tables were pushed together to create one long communal space, and Ruby and her staff served up a feast of comfort food. Jack sat at the end of the table, nursing a cup of coffee as laughter and conversation filled the room. Ruby joined him, sliding into the seat beside him. "You don't take much time to enjoy yourself, do you?" she teased. Jack offered a faint smile. "Old habits." Ruby studied him for a moment. "You've done more for this town than anyone could have asked for. You should be proud of that." Jack's gaze shifted to the people around him, the families, the volunteers, the sheriff. "I'm proud of them," he said quietly. "They're the reason we made it through." Ruby placed a hand on his arm. "And you're the reason they believed they could." Later that night, Jack returned to his truck, parked in its usual spot near the diner. The cab felt like a second home, a space that had seen countless miles and endless horizons. But tonight, it felt different. He stared out the windshield at the quiet street, his thoughts drifting to the battles he'd fought, not just in Mayfield, but throughout his life. For years, he had carried the weight of his past, the mistakes and losses that haunted him. But here, in this small town, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing: purpose. As he leaned back in his seat, the sound of footsteps on gravel drew his attention. Ruby stood outside, a small smile on her face. "Thought I'd find you here," she said. Jack opened the door, gesturing for her to sit. "Couldn't sleep?" Ruby shook her head. "Too much on my mind." "You?" "Same," Jack admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the hum of the night settling around them. "Thank you," Ruby said finally, her voice soft. "For what?" "For giving us a reason to fight back," she replied. "For showing us we could." Jack didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "You didn't need me to show you that. You had it in you all along." Ruby smiled, her eyes glistening. "Maybe, but it helps to have someone believe in you." As dawn broke over Mayfield, the town stood as a testament to resilience and unity. The scars of the battle remained, but they were overshadowed by the strength of its people. For Jack, the journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. And for Mayfield, a new chapter had begun, one defined not by fear, but by the unshakable bond of a community that refused to back down. The sun rose over Mayfield, casting a golden glow across the town. The faint hum of rebuilding filled the air as residents worked side by side, repairing what had been damaged during the Black Wolves' assault. Laughter mixed with the sound of hammers and saws, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Jack Harlow stood on the diner's porch, watching the activity with quiet pride. His shoulders still ached, but the pain was a small price to pay for what the town had gained. Beside him, Ruby Morales leaned against the railing, her face reflecting the same sense of satisfaction. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Ruby said. "Just a week ago, people were too afraid to leave their homes. Now look at them." Jack nodded. "Fear's a powerful thing, but so is hope. Once people realize what they're capable of, there's no stopping them." Ruby glanced at him, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "You had a lot to do with that, you know?" Jack didn't reply, but the faintest hint of a smile crossed his face. Later that morning, a small ceremony was held in the town square. The makeshift stage was decorated with flowers and banners reading, "Thank you, Mayfield Heroes." Nearly the entire town gathered, their faces lit with gratitude and pride. Mayor Ellis Reed stepped up to the microphone, his usually reserved demeanor replaced with a rare warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we celebrate not just a victory, but the strength of this community. We stood together against impossible odds and proved that Mayfield isn't just a town, it's a family." Applause rippled through the crowd as Ellis gestured toward the group standing behind him. Jack, Ruby, Sheriff Donovan, Mia, and Sam stepped forward, their presence met with cheers and whistles. "Each of these individuals played a vital role in protecting Mayfield," Ellis continued. Jack Harlow, in particular, showed us what it means to lead with courage and determination. Jack, on behalf of the entire town, we thank you." The applause grew louder, and Jack shifted uncomfortably and used to the attention. He stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady but humble. "This wasn't about me," he began. "It was about all of you. You didn't back down. You didn't give in to fear. You fought for your town, your families, and your neighbors. That's what made the difference. I'm proud to have stood with you." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the square. As the celebration continued, Jack wandered to the edge of the crowd, seeking a moment of quiet. Ruby found him there, 2 glasses of lemonade in hand. "You're not much for speeches, are you?" she teased, handing him a glass. "Not really my thing," Jack admitted, taking a sip. Ruby tilted her head, studying him. "So, what's next for Jack Harlow? Back on the road?" Jack gazed out over the town, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe for a while, but I think I'll stick around. Mayfield's got something I haven't found in a long time. A reason to stay." Ruby smiled. "Well, the diner could use a regular like you. And maybe more than that." Jack met her gaze, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of something more. The days that followed were a mix of normalcy and growth. The diner reopened, its repaired windows letting in the warm light of the desert sun. Families returned to their routines, children played in the park, and the scars of the past began to fade. Mia stayed in Mayfield, opening a permanent self-defense training center. Sam, too, decided to remain, expanding the town's security system into a model that other communities began to replicate. Sheriff Donovan, now with a bolstered reputation and renewed confidence, worked closely with the state police to ensure that Mayfield remained safe. And Jack, for the first time in a long time, found himself at home. He took odd jobs around town, helped out at the diner, and slowly allowed himself to be part of the community he had helped save. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat on the porch of the diner, Ruby beside him. The streetlights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the quiet street. "You know," Ruby said, breaking the silence, "I don't think Mayfield's ever been stronger." Jack nodded. "Because people finally realized what they're capable of. They don't need someone to fight for them anymore. They can fight for themselves." Ruby leaned back, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Still, it doesn't hurt to have someone like you around." Jack chuckled softly, the sound rare but genuine. "Guess I'm not going anywhere." The two sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the town a soothing backdrop. Mayfield had found its footing, and so had Jack. For the first time in years, both man and town faced the future with hope.